I was driving to my son's place when he called from the police station, crying, "Dad, please help me. My father-in-law had me arrested." My blood boiled. I turned around and called one person, freeze his assets, and fire every last one of them. I pulled onto the shoulder of Route 9 and just sat there for a second. Engine still running, hazards ticking against the quiet. A school bus went by in the other direction, kids' faces pressed to the glass, completely unaware that 30 feet away a man's whole life was cracking open. My son doesn't cry. Hasn't since he was maybe 11 years old, the time he came off his bike on Miller's Hill and broke his wrist so bad the bone showed through the skin, and even then he mostly just went white and quiet and asked if his bike was okay. He's never been a crier. That's not a criticism. It's just who he is. Steady, even when it costs him something to be steady. And now he was whispering into a phone from inside a police station, voice shaking so hard I could barely make out the words, because his father-in-law had decided that arresting him was easier than asking him one question. "Dad," he said again. "Dad, please, I need you to come get me." "Nathan, where are you?" "I'm at the station on South Main." "Dad, they arrested me." I had been on my way to drop off a ladder he'd borrowed for gutter work, running errands on a Tuesday evening like it was any other Tuesday evening. Now I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles had gone bloodless. Arrested for what? Theft. They're saying I stole from the company. "Dad, I didn't do this. I swear to you, I didn't do this." "Who called it in?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you something before the words do. Then he said the name, and something in my chest went very still, very cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the October air coming through my cracked window. Clinton did. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just sat there with the engine idling, watching the taillights of the school bus shrink down the road, watching an ordinary evening keep being ordinary for everyone except us. "I'm coming," I told him. "Don't say another word to anybody until I get there. Not one word." I hung up, and I want to be honest about what happened in the 60 seconds after that, because it matters. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my hand on the dashboard or curse the air blue, the way you might expect a father to when he hears his son is sitting in a cell over something he didn't do. What happened instead was quieter, and if I'm being truthful, more dangerous. Something in me went very calm, the specific calm I remembered from 31 years in commercial banking, the calm that shows up right before you have to make a decision that can't be walked back. I put the truck in drive, made a U-turn in the middle of Route 9 without bothering to signal, and called the one person I knew could move faster than a county courthouse. "Raymond," I said when he picked up, "I need you to pull a file for me tonight. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand who my son actually is, because that's the part that matters most, and it's the part that got erased the second those handcuffs went on. Nathan is the kind of guy who shows up early to work, not because anyone's watching, but because the delivery trucks need loading before the heat sets in, and somebody has to be the one who does it without being asked. When one of the older drivers at the company, a man named Gary who'd been hauling freight for 22 years, had a heart scare in the parking lot back in the spring, Nathan rode with him in the ambulance and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours. He didn't call anyone to brag about it. I only found out because Gary's wife mentioned it to me almost in passing months later at a cookout, like it was nothing. To Nathan, it was nothing. That's the whole point of him. Nobody puts small things on a resume, but small things are what tell you who somebody really is. He gives up his lunch break most days to help train the new hires nobody else wants to train, the slow ones, the nervous ones, the ones who ask the same question 4 times before it sticks. He drives 40 minutes out of his way every other Sunday to help an elderly neighbor carry her groceries up 3 flights of stairs because the building doesn't have an elevator and her knees don't work the way they used to. Small things. He's never once mentioned any of it to me. I've had to piece together the shape of my own son from other people's stray comments, which either means he's private or it means he simply doesn't think generosity is something you're supposed to announce. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years in commercial banking before I retired 2 years back, and now I do consulting work for small businesses out of a home office on Maplewood Drive. I've got a decent marriage, a mediocre golf swing, and one honest flaw I'm not particularly proud of. I believed for most of Nathan's adult life that giving him space meant respecting him. I thought staying out of his business was the same thing as being a good father. I was wrong about that, and it took what happened next to teach me the difference. Nathan grew up watching me work long hours, watching his mother hold the house together while I was buried in loan files, and somewhere in there he decided he was going to be the kind of man who didn't need anybody to bail him out. He put himself through 2 years of community college doing HVAC repair on weekends. He never asked us for money, not once, not even the year his transmission went, and he was walking 3 miles to a bus stop every morning rather than call and ask for help. I used to think that stubbornness was going to serve him well someday. I didn't think it would mean that when the worst night of his life happened, he'd sit in a holding cell for the better part of an hour trying to figure out how to handle it himself before he finally called me. That's the boy who was sitting on a metal bench in a county holding cell because a man in a gray sport coat decided that arresting his own son-in-law was a reasonable way to handle a bookkeeping question. 3 years ago, Nathan married a young woman named Claire. Claire is wonderful, warm, funny, sharper than anyone gives her credit for. The kind of person who remembers your birthday and your coffee order and the fact that you mentioned once, in passing, that your knee had been bothering you. She and Nathan met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and within 6 months I could tell it was the real thing. The kind of match you don't don't try to talk anybody out of. Her father is a man named Clinton, and Clinton owns a mid-sized trucking and logistics company out on Route 4 near the rail yard, the kind of business that quietly moves half the freight in 3 counties without anyone outside the industry ever hearing the name. When Nathan and Claire got married, Clinton offered Nathan a job as operations manager. At the time, I remember thinking it was generous, maybe even a little bit of an olive branch, a father-in-law trying to build a bridge to the man his daughter had chosen. I didn't understand yet what strings were sewn into that generosity, or how a job offer from a man like Clinton was never really a gift so much as a leash with some slack in it. Clinton is not a man who raises his voice. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to picture him as some kind of loud, red-faced tyrant barking orders across a warehouse floor. He isn't. He's quiet. He wears the same charcoal sport coat to every company function, every holiday party, every ribbon cutting for a new loading dock, as if he owns exactly one and refuses to be seen as a man who cares enough about appearances to own 2. He shakes your hand exactly once, firmly, and never again after that, like the transaction is complete and there's no reason to repeat it. That coldness, I'd come to learn over the following weeks, was the most dangerous thing about him. Loud men give themselves away. Quiet men make you work to find out what they're capable of. I met Clinton maybe a dozen times over the 3 years of Nathan and Claire's marriage. Thanksgivings, the wedding itself, a couple of 4th of July gatherings at his place on the lake. He was always perfectly civil to me. Never warm, but civil. I never once saw him lose his composure. I used to think that was a kind of strength. I know better now. Some men aren't calm because they've mastered themselves. They're calm because cruelty, for them, doesn't require any effort at all. It's just the resting state. Nathan took to the job well, or at least that's what he told us, and I believed him because Nathan isn't the type to complain even when complaining would be justified. He worked his way into the role, learned the fleet routing software, got to know the drivers by name the same way he'd gotten to know Gary and every other co-worker he'd ever had. Claire told my wife once at a family dinner that her father had actually complimented Nathan's work ethic to her directly, which apparently was rare enough that she'd remembered the exact words. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away as a good sign, evidence that maybe the leash Clinton had handed Nathan wasn't as tight as it looked. I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about a lot of things where Clinton Webb was concerned, and I wouldn't understand exactly how wrong until a Tuesday night in October when my phone rang and a school bus was going by and my son was crying for the first time since he was 11 years old. The station on South Main is a squat brick building with fluorescent lighting that makes everyone under it look like they've been awake for 3 days straight, guilty or not. I signed in at the front desk, gave my name, gave Nathan's name, and sat in a plastic chair bolted to the floor for 11 minutes before someone finally came to get me. They brought me back to a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a public defender who looked barely older than Nathan, a young woman named Priya who had a legal pad in front of her with maybe 6 lines written on it. Nathan was sitting across from her in a folding chair, still in his work clothes, a grease stain on the knee of his jeans from an early shift he'd worked that morning like it was any other day. When he saw me, he didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes for a second, like he'd been holding his breath since the handcuffs went on and could finally let some of it out now that I was in the room. "Tell me everything," I said, sitting down across from both of them. From the start, Priya went first, reading off her notes in the flat, careful voice of someone still learning how to deliver bad news without letting it show on her face. 2 days earlier, a discrepancy had turned up in one of the company's fuel accounts, roughly $4,000 unaccounted for across several weeks of deliveries. Instead of pulling the security footage himself, instead of asking Nathan a single direct question about where he'd been on the days in question, Clinton had gone straight to his head of security, a man named Reggie Doss, and told him to build a case. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, the way I had to sit with it in that fluorescent room. Build a case, not find the truth, not figure out what happened. Build a case, like the outcome had already been decided, and all that remained was assembling the evidence to support it. "They're saying my badge swiped into the fuel depot at the exact time the discrepancy happened," Nathan said, and his voice cracked on the word exact, like the precision of it was its own kind of insult. "Dad, I was in Cincinnati that whole afternoon. I was at a supplier meeting. There were 3 other people there. I have the meeting invite on my phone. I have my hotel receipt. I have everything. Do the police have any of that?" I tried to tell them. The officer who processed me said I could explain it to the judge. I looked at Priya. "How does a badge swipe get logged if the person carrying the badge is 2 states away?" She hesitated, which told me she'd already been wondering the same thing, and didn't yet have an answer she trusted enough to say out loud. "I don't know yet. I'd need access to the depot's security logs, and web distribution hasn't been exactly forthcoming with those." "Of course they haven't," I said, and I could hear something in my own voice that I didn't entirely recognize. Not anger exactly, something colder and more organized than anger. "Because if you look at those logs closely enough, you might find something that doesn't fit the story they've already decided to tell." Nathan put his face in his hands for a moment, elbows on the table, and I watched my son, 29 years old, a grown man who rode in an ambulance with a co-worker he barely knew and never told a soul about it, try to hold himself together in a room that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. "I didn't do this," he said again, muffled through his hands. "I need you to believe me." "I already believe you," I said. "I need you to let me handle the rest. He looked up at that, and something passed between us that I don't have good words for even now. Maybe it was the first time in a long while that he let himself be the kid again, instead of the man who handles everything himself. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Either way, he nodded, and Priya started explaining bail procedures, and somewhere underneath the numbness, I was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already running through everyone. I still had a phone number for who owed me a favor from the old days at the bank. I called Clinton from the parking lot of the police station that night, standing beside my truck with the October air cutting through my jacket, watching my breath fog in the sodium light from the street lamps. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting the call and had decided in advance exactly how he was going to handle it. "Walter," he said, and his voice was the same flat, unhurried thing it always was, like we were about to discuss a golf tee time instead of the fact that his son-in-law was sitting in a cell. "Clinton, it's Walter. I need you to tell me what's going on with Nathan. There's a discrepancy in the accounts," he said. "I take theft seriously. I have to. He was in Cincinnati, Clinton. He has 3 witnesses who can put him at a supplier meeting the entire afternoon in question. He has a hotel receipt. He has a calendar invite. This isn't a mystery you need Reggie Doss to solve for you." "Then he'll have his chance to prove all of that," Clinton said, and there was no heat in it whatsoever, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. "That's what the process is for. You had your own son-in-law arrested before you even asked him a single question." There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear something in the background on his end, a television maybe, or the low hum of a house settling for the night, the ordinary sounds of a man who was about to say something monstrous from the comfort of his own living room. "This isn't personal, Walter," he finally said. "It's business. Your daughter is married to him. Your grandchildren, if you two ever have any, would carry his name. How is that not personal?" "He should have read his contract more carefully," Clinton said, and something about the phrase landed strange in my ear even then. Some flicker of a thought I couldn't quite chase down in the moment, buried under everything else I was feeling. I'd remember that sentence later. I'd turn it over and over in my head until it cracked open into something I could actually use. "Clinton," he didn't let me finish. I heard the soft click of the call ending. Not a slam, not a dramatic hang-up, just the quiet sound of a man who considered the conversation complete and saw no reason to prolong it. Somehow that click was worse than if he'd screamed at me. Screaming, at least, would have meant he felt something. I stood there in the parking lot for a long minute after that, phone still in my hand, watching my own breath disappear into the dark. I thought about all the family gatherings I'd sat through with this man, the 4th of July cookouts, the handshake he gave exactly once and never repeated, the charcoal sport coat he wore like a uniform. I thought about how easy it had been for him, all this time, to be perfectly pleasant to my face while apparently being capable of this. I want to tell you what that phone call felt like, walking back into the building to sit with my son, because it wasn't rage, not the kind you're picturing. Rage is loud. Rage burns hot and fast and usually burns itself out by morning. This was different. This was quiet, and it didn't burn at all. It just sat there in my chest, cold and patient, waiting for me to figure out what to do with it. By the time I got back inside, Nathan and Priya were deep in a conversation about bail hearings, about how long the process might take, about the earliest possible date they could get in front of a judge. I sat back down across from my son and didn't say anything about the call. Not yet. There wasn't anything useful to say. What I had instead was a sentence rattling around in my skull. He should have read his contract more carefully, and the beginning of an idea about exactly whose contract that sentence was really about. The next 2 days, I let the system try to fix itself. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters for understanding what came after. I didn't go straight to the nuclear option. I tried it the normal way first. I told myself the process would work the way it's supposed to work, that evidence would surface and reasonable people would look at it, and my son would walk out of this with an apology and maybe a lawsuit against web distribution for good measure. I hired a second lawyer to sit alongside Priya, a sharp, gray-haired man named Donald Ferris, who'd spent 20 years doing corporate litigation before deciding he'd rather help ordinary people who got run over by companies like Clinton's. Donald moved fast. Within a day, he'd filed a motion demanding the depot's full badge swipe records going back 6 months, not just the day in question, because he wanted to see the pattern, not just the one data point Clinton's people were pointing to. That's when Denise Coyle got involved, though nobody asked her to. Denise runs the front office at Web Distribution and has worked there longer than Claire has been alive. She's 51 years old, sharp as a tack, and apparently one of the only people in that building who still believed loyalty meant something beyond a paycheck. The night Nathan was arrested, Denise drove Claire to the police station herself, sat with her in the waiting room, held her hand, and kept repeating the same line, quiet like a promise. "We take care of our own. That's just what we do." Denise also happened to be the one person at the company with unsupervised access to the depot's swipe logs, and she happened to notice something Reggie Doss either hadn't looked for or hadn't wanted to find. The badge reader at that particular gate had been malfunctioning for 11 straight days prior to the discrepancy, logging phantom entries at random hours, sometimes registering swipes for badges that were, according to the timesheets, nowhere near the building. She printed the full report herself, on her own time, off the clock, and handed it directly to Priya without telling a single soul at the company what she'd done. For a while, it looked like it might be that simple. By Thursday morning, Donald had the malfunction records formally submitted. He had 3 signed statements from the Cincinnati supplier meeting confirming swearing Nathan's alibi down to the hour. He had the hotel receipt, the calendar invite, the whole neat, quiet stack of proof that should have made this go away in an afternoon. Calls started going back and forth between Donald's office and the county prosecutor's office, and for about 6 hours that Thursday, I let myself believe it. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I actually believed that somewhere in a windowless office downtown, a prosecutor was looking at a stack of malfunction logs and alibi statements and thinking, well, that settles that, and any minute now my phone was going to ring with Priya's voice telling me the charges had been dropped. Evidence surfaces, charges get reconsidered, everybody goes home. That's how it's supposed to work. It didn't work that way. By Friday afternoon, Clinton's legal team had started stalling, not fighting the evidence exactly. They couldn't fight it. It was airtight, but delaying, requesting extensions on paperwork they'd already received, asking for additional time to review the malfunction data internally before agreeing to any joint filing with the prosecutor. Missed calls piled up between Donald's office and the county, 11 on Friday alone, then 29 by the following Wednesday, each one a small, bureaucratic brick being laid in a wall that had no purpose except to keep my son inside a system for a few more days than the truth required. I understood what was happening before Donald even explained it to me in plain terms. Clinton wasn't trying to win the case anymore. He knew he'd already lost the case. What he was trying to do was make sure Nathan spent at least one weekend in a cell, make sure the story got around the industry, make sure everyone who mattered understood exactly what happened to people who married into his family without sufficiently impressing him first. He was running out the clock on principle, spending his own legal team's billable hours just to make a point about power. That's when I stopped waiting on the system to handle this the normal way. I sat at my kitchen table that Friday night with the coffee gone cold for the second time that week, and I thought about the sentence Clinton had said to me on the phone, the one that had been rattling around in my skull for 3 days. He should have read his contract more carefully. I thought about how strange it was for a man like Clinton, a man who chose every word like he was rationing them, to use that particular phrase about a man who didn't have any contract with him at all. Nathan wasn't bound by anything Clinton had drafted. Nathan was an employee, not a signatory to anything, but somebody was. Somebody had signed a contract with Clinton 11 years ago, back when web distribution was 6 weeks from closing its doors forever, and that somebody had never once told Clinton who they actually were. That somebody was me. 11 years ago, before Nathan had ever met Claire, before any of these people had ever heard the name Walter Briggs, web distribution nearly went under. It was a bad diesel contract that started the trouble, locked in at a rate that made sense the year it was signed and made no sense at all. 2 years later, when fuel prices spiked and the company found itself bleeding money on every route it ran, then came 2 separate lawsuits, one from a driver injured on a poorly maintained trailer, and one from a warehouse client alleging chronic late deliveries, both of them the kind of slow, grinding legal drain that doesn't kill a company outright, but starves it one settlement at a time. By the time the bank Clinton had been using for over a decade started making noise about calling the loan, web distribution was, by any honest accounting, about 6 weeks from closing its doors for good. I was a senior commercial lender at the time, working out of a branch across town, and web distribution's file crossed my desk almost by accident, forwarded to me by a colleague who specialized in transportation sector lending and happened to be out on medical leave that particular month. I remember sitting with that file on a Sunday afternoon, my own kids still young then, coffee going cold the way it seems to do whenever I'm making an important decision, and looking at the numbers underneath the crisis. The core business was sound, the roots were profitable, the clients were loyal. What web distribution needed wasn't a bailout so much as breathing room, a way to restructure the debt so the company could survive its own bad year without a bank foreclosing on the whole operation out of an abundance of caution. I saw a company worth saving. That's really the whole of it. I didn't do it out of any particular fondness for Clinton Webb, whom I'd never met and knew nothing about beyond what was in the file. I did it because it was good lending, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that had defined my entire career, finding value where a nervous institution only saw risk. I structured a private note through a holding entity rather than through the bank directly, which was unusual but not unheard of for a situation this delicate. It let the restructuring move faster, outside the layers of committee approval that would have taken months web distribution didn't have. I set up the entity with my own capital, separate from the bank entirely, a decision that would have raised eyebrows if anyone at my branch had known about it, though nothing about it was improper. I've always been careful about that distinction. Nothing bent. Everything by the book, filed correctly, taxed correctly, disclosed correctly to everyone who had a legal right to know. I named the entity Maplewood Capital, after the street I live on, because I've never much cared about having my name attached to things. That's not false modesty, it's just how I was built. I spent 3 decades structuring deals that kept other people's businesses alive, and I almost never needed anyone to know it was me behind the curtain. Quiet work. That's the only kind I ever really respected. The note itself was standard in almost every respect. A restructured payment schedule, a reasonable interest rate, the usual representations and warranties you'd expect in any commercial lending document. But buried in paragraph 41, in the kind of boilerplate covenant language that lawyers write and clients skim past because it reads like it will never actually matter, was a clause about material adverse actions. Any legal action taken against against a company employee without documented board review, resulting in reputational or financial harm to the company, would constitute a default event under the note. And a default event, per the terms Clinton's own attorney had negotiated and signed off on 11 years earlier, gave the note holder the right to assume interim operational control of the company until the default was cured. It's not an unusual clause. Lenders put language like that in commercial notes all the time, a kind of insurance policy against a borrower making reckless decisions that tank the collateral. Clinton's attorney at the time, a competent but overworked man named Philip Aldrich, had negotiated the note in good faith, focused entirely on the interest rate and the repayment schedule, the two things that actually seem to matter to a man watching his client's company circle the drain. Paragraph 41 probably got maybe 90 seconds of his attention. I don't blame him for that. Most lawyers would have done the same. You don't spend your limited negotiating capital fighting over language you assume will never be triggered. Clinton Webb signed that note without ever learning who was actually behind Maplewood Capital. He paid it down faithfully for 11 years, mostly on schedule, occasionally a few weeks late but never in default, never giving me or anyone else a reason to think about paragraph 41 again. He built his company back up from 6 weeks of insolvency into the solid, profitable operation it is today. He bought the lake house. He wore the same charcoal sport coat to every function, like a man who'd earned the right to stop caring about appearances because he'd already proven himself. And somewhere in all of that, he must have entirely forgotten, if he ever really registered it at all, that somewhere in a filing cabinet, in language his own lawyer had approved without a second thought, sat a mechanism that could hand control of his entire company to a stranger the moment he did something reckless enough to trigger it. He had no idea that the man he'd told on the phone 3 days earlier to have his son-in-law read his contract more carefully was the one person alive who actually held the paper that mattered. I called Raymond Cole first thing Saturday morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, and gave him one instruction: pull the Webb distribution note, confirm the default language was still enforceable after 11 years, and do it exactly by the book. Nothing bent. I wanted it airtight enough that no attorney on Clinton's payroll, however talented, could find a seam in it. Raymond had been my attorney for close to 20 years, ever since a business dispute back when I was still active at the bank, and he'd learned over that time that when I called him with a flat, quiet voice like the one I used that Saturday morning, it meant I'd already made up my mind and simply needed the paperwork to catch up to the decision. It took him the better part of the weekend and into Monday to confirm what I already suspected, that the covenant in paragraph 41 was not only still valid, but had never been amended, renegotiated, or waived in any of the subsequent refinancing conversations Clinton's people had done over the years. It was sitting there exactly as written, untouched, waiting for 11 years for someone to need it. While Raymond worked, I watched from a distance as Clinton's legal team kept up their stalling game, apparently confident that a few extra days of delay would teach my son and his family an unspoken lesson about whose company this really was. I let them believe that. I didn't call Clinton again. I didn't tip my hand in any way. I sat with Nathan and Claire on Sunday, the three of us eating a quiet dinner at their kitchen table, Claire's eyes red-rimmed from 3 days of not sleeping properly, Nathan picking at his food and trying to reassure her that everything was going to be fine, even though none of us actually knew that yet. I didn't tell either of them what I was doing. There would be time for that later. For now, I let them believe the only hope was the slow, grinding machinery of the county prosecutor's office, because I hadn't yet earned the right to promise them anything better. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 9 days after that phone call on Route 9, Raymond and I walked into Clinton Webb's office at Webb Distribution's headquarters. It was 2:20 in the afternoon. I remember the time specifically because I'd checked my watch in the parking lot, a habit left over from 31 years of showing up to meetings on the dot, and I wanted this particular meeting to start exactly when I intended it to start. Clinton's office looked exactly like I'd pictured it from the way Nathan had described it. Spare, efficient, a single framed photo of Claire on the desk, and nothing else personal in sight, as if sentiment were a liability he'd trained himself out of long ago. He looked up when we walked in, mildly annoyed, the way you'd look up at an unscheduled interruption during a busy week. "Walter," he said, "I don't have much time." "You're going to want to make time," I said, and I sat down across from him without waiting to be asked, Raymond taking the chair beside me and setting a manila folder on the edge of the desk. Clinton's eyes moved to the folder and then back to me, some flicker of unease crossing his face before he covered it quickly. "What is this?" "11 years ago, your company was 6 weeks from closing its doors," I said. "Somebody bought your note and kept you afloat when your own bank was ready to walk away. That somebody was me." I watched something behind his eyes go very still, the first genuine stillness I'd ever seen in him, different from his usual composed quiet. The stillness of a man realizing the ground beneath him wasn't quite what he'd assumed it was. "Paragraph 41 of that note," I continued, "gives the holder the right to assume interim operational control if the company takes material legal action against an employee without proper board review. You had my son arrested on a theft charge you never verified, based on evidence your own head of security fabricated, and you did it to punish him for marrying your daughter without asking your permission first. That's a default event, Clinton." He didn't say anything for a long moment. The office was quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the building's HVAC fax system somewhere overhead, then finally, quietly, "You're bluffing." Raymond opened the folder and slid the documents across the desk without a word. I watched Clinton's hands, steady, practiced, executive hands that had probably signed 1,000 contracts without a tremor, begin to shake slightly as he read the first page, then the second, his composure cracking in real time in a way I don't think he'd allowed anyone to witness in decades. "Check the signature page," I said. He turned to it. I watched his eyes find his own signature, 11 years younger, made in a moment of desperation he'd probably spent a decade trying to forget, right below a line identifying the note holder as Maplewood Capital LLC, with no further explanation of who stood behind that name because none had ever been required. "Effective this morning," I said. "Maplewood Capital has exercised its rights under the note. Company accounts are frozen pending review. Reggie Doss is terminated effective immediately for fabricating evidence in a criminal complaint. Your head of HR, who signed off on my son's arrest without a single conversation with him, is terminated as well. I'm not interested in punishing you, Clinton. I'm interested in making sure nobody at this company ever does to another family what was done to mine." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd known him, through 3 years of holiday dinners and lake house cookouts and that single, firm, never-repeated handshake, his voice actually cracked at the edges. "He's my son-in-law," he said. "He was your son-in-law when you had him arrested too," I said. "That didn't seem to matter then." He set the folder down slowly on his desk, like it might do something more if he moved it too fast. "What do you want, Walter?" "Right now, I want the charges against my son dropped by the end of the day. I want written confirmation from the prosecutor's office by 5 o'clock. I want Reggie Doss's termination processed today, not next week, not after some internal review that gives him time to clean out his files. And I want everyone in this building, every driver, every dispatcher, every person who answers a phone here, to understand that nobody touches my family again without going through me first." Clinton didn't argue. I think some part of him had already run the numbers, had already understood in the 60 seconds it took to read paragraph 41 that there was no version of this where he came out ahead by fighting. He reached for his phone with a hand that still hadn't quite steadied itself. The same hands I'd watched shaking over the documents minutes earlier, betraying something he'd spent 3 years making sure nobody ever saw. "Understand something else," I said before he could dial. "I didn't do this because I wanted your company. I did it because 11 years ago I saw something worth saving, and you just spent a week proving to me that the man I saved it for isn't the man I thought I was dealing with." He looked up at me, phone still in his hand, and for just a moment the charcoal sport coat and the single firm handshake and all 3 years of perfect practiced composure fell away completely, and underneath it was just a man who'd built something out of nothing twice in his life and had no idea, until this exact second, how close he'd come to losing it the second time over his own pride. I stood up. Raymond gathered the documents back into the folder without a word, and neither of us spoke as we crossed the office toward the door. Clinton still sitting there behind his desk with the phone in his hand, and the folder's absence suddenly loud in the room. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph worth savoring, nothing that felt the way I might have imagined revenge feeling if you'd asked me a month earlier whether I was capable of something like this. What I felt instead, walking out of that office and leaving Clinton Webb alone with a phone in his shaking hand, and 11 years of buried paragraph 41 finally come due, was something quieter than victory. Just the plain, unadorned weight of watching a cold man, for the first time in 3 years of knowing him, actually feel something.